In Module 3, we explore the lowest level of psychological functioning, that is, psychology at the level of our brains and nervous system. In Module 4, we began to discuss how these neural signals can be translated into our conscious, perceptual experience of the world around us. We didn't talk much about the inner workings of the mind in Module 5 because remember that behaviorists were adamantly opposed to this idea. However, starting around the 1980s, researchers began to apply the rigorous scientific methods espoused by behaviorists to the study of mental processes. The result was the cognitive revolution and a greater understanding of how we think, feel, learn, and make decisions. So now, in Module 6, we fully turn our attention to the next level of psychological functioning, that is, cognition. Stated simply, cognition is the study of how we think. As discussed in Module 1.2, cognitive psychologists study things like language, emotion, problem-solving, reasoning, and memory. Cognition is a broad field and encompasses many interesting topics. In fact, far too many for us to cover in this module. Instead, I'll focus my attention on the basics of mental representation, which we'll cover in this video, and memory, covered in the subsequent two videos. Take a moment now to examine the following images. My guess is that even though you've probably never seen these exact three pictures before, you likely had no trouble identifying that one is a bear, one is a dog, and one is a bird. But how did you know? Learning to recognize different animals, or objects, or people, may seem like a rather obvious, even elementary skill. In fact, most children can do this after only a few years old. But when you stop and think about it, this is actually a pretty remarkable mental feat. Without ever having seen these pictures before, your brain can easily identify them into the appropriate categories. This is because our brains naturally like to put similar information together into concepts or mental representations of categories. Concepts are organized hierarchically, as you can see in this picture. When describing an object, most people prefer the basic level of categorization. For example, on the previous slide, I referred to each animal as a bear, a dog, and a bird. I could have been more specific, like calling them a grizzly bear, a Labrador retriever, or a barn swallow, or I could have been more general by simply calling each an animal. However, the basic level of categorization seems to provide a right balance between a category that is not too general, but also not too specific, unless greater specificity is warranted by the context. Related clusters of concepts can also be grouped together into schemas. For example, you might have a schema for athlete that includes concepts like strong, fast, and disciplined. In fact, we can have schemata for many different types of things. Research shows that we each have a self-schema that includes all the relevant concepts we believe apply to ourselves. We can also have schemata for events, like going to a wedding or ordering food at a restaurant. These schemata for events are also sometimes called cognitive scripts because, like a script for a play, they detail how the event is supposed to play out. Concepts and schemata are exceptionally helpful because they enable us to navigate the world around us, including new situations. For example, imagine trying out a new restaurant for the first time. Without concepts, you'd have no idea how to identify any of the objects in the room, having never encountered those specific items before. However, because we have a concept for things like table, chair, menu, etc., our brain can easily identify these items and their function without any difficulty. Moreover, without a cognitive script for ordering at a restaurant, you'd have no idea what to do once you sat down. Should you shout out your order to the waitstaff or go prepare your own meal in the kitchen? Instead, because you have a schema for this particular situation, you know that you'll likely be handed a menu, asked what you'd like to drink, given a few minutes to decide which meal option you'd prefer, and then tell the waitstaff your order. In fact, my roommate and I recently had the opportunity to travel to Europe, and we were even able to order at restaurants where we were unfamiliar with the native language, all because the basic script for this event still stayed the same. Or imagine your first college class that you took in person. Although you might have been a bit nervous, not knowing quite what to expect, you could still easily identify the table, chairs, and whiteboard when you walked in the room. And because you have a schema for professor, which includes somebody older and probably nicer dressed, you likely had no trouble identifying your instructor even before he or she introduced themselves. Finally, because you have a cognitive script for attending class, you knew that once you entered the room, you'd need to find a seat and be ready to take notes while listening to your instructor give a lecture. Concepts and schema are certainly quite helpful. However, how does our brain know which objects belong to which categories? Again, although this might seem relatively straightforward, it's actually been kind of a tricky question to answer empirically. Let's go back to our example with our three animals, bear, dog, and bird. It might seem like each category should have a relatively straightforward definition with key defining features. For example, birds have feathers and wings and can fly, while dogs and bears cannot. So you might think that for something to qualify as a bird, it must meet these particular characteristics. Yet, not all birds can fly, and the features of some birds, like penguins, look quite different from those of other birds, like barn swallows. Moreover, how can we distinguish between a bear and a dog? Both are mammals, and both have 4 legs, and both have fur. Bears are typically bigger than dogs, but not always. Some dogs, like Great Pyrenees, are really large, and some bears, like the sun bear, are on the smaller side. In short, it's not as easy to define a category as you might think. Rather than using a list of key features to define each category, instead, cognitive psychologists think that when encountering a novel object, we likely make some sort of a comparison based on our past experience. Exactly how we make that comparison, though, has been a subject of academic debate. Specifically, there are 2 main competing theories that attempt to describe how our brains recognize objects, animals, or people as members of specific categories. The first theory, prototype theory, proposes that for each category, we have a prototype or best example of that particular category in our minds. For example, a songbird, like the barn swallow, might be a good prototype for the category bird because songbirds chirp, eat worms, and have wings and feathers and can fly, all features that are highly typical of birds. Prototype theory argues that when encountering a new stimulus, such as this ostrich perhaps, we compare it to the prototype. Stimuli that are similar enough to the prototype may be incorporated into that category. Updated versions of prototype theory propose that rather than the prototype being the most typical exemplar, like this barn swallow, the prototype may instead be a bundle of correlated features, like eating worms, singing, having wings, with some features being weighted as more heavily important to include membership in that category. It does appear to be true that some objects are considered more typical or more prototypical of their categories than others. However, prototype theory has appeared to be insufficient to explain how people actually recognize new objects. Instead, exemplar theory proposes that when encountering an object for the first time, we compare it to all the previous examples of similar objects in that category that we've previously encountered. If a new stimulus is similar enough to some of these stored examples, it can also become assimilated into that category. In this video, we covered the basics of mental representation. For the exam, you should be able to define concept and schema and explain how they help to navigate the world around us, define prototype, and explain the difference between prototype theory and exemplar theory.